Hello everyone, my name is Fernando. I'm a solutions engineer here at Replicated, and I'd like to walk you through host preflights. We'll go through some slides here to kind of explain you the concepts, and then I'll switch over to my desktop, kind of show you some examples. So let's start by explaining what are host preflight checks. So host preflight checks are checks that are performed on the Linux machine before Kubernetes is installed via kURL. For those of you familiar with Replicated, this will be the embedded cluster when we go to install it, Kubernetes on it. But it ensures that the node is going to have the necessary requirements to perform the installation. It's making sure that the installation is going to be successful. If a preflight check fails, the install will be blocked and it will exit, and you'll be back to the prompt. Now, if you want to override the default behavior, you have a few options. One is you can bypass failures with the host preflight ignore flag. If you kind of want to go the opposite way and be more conservative, you can also pass a host preflights enforce warning flag, and that will block the install also on warnings, not just failures. There's also the exclude built-in host preflight, and this can be used to skip the default host preflight checks if you want to run your custom checks. Also note that in the case of a host preflight check, it will consist of both a collector and a corresponding analyzer. On the slide here, we have an example of the CPU collector and analyzer. So it's the CPU preflight check. In this case, we're just defining collect CPU stuff, and then we have a CPU check name that is looking for a number of CPUs. There are other preflight checks in which you may need to reference the collector name in the analyzer. We'll see an example of that during the demo. Now, these are the available host preflight checks. Hopefully, you'll have access to this slide deck on your own. But all these are links to the actual place in the documentation. So if once you have the slides, go ahead and click on any of these, and you'll have the instructions on each of one. So if we want to look at CPU, it takes you to the CPU collector, the parameters it takes, and the CPU analyzer. To view all the other ones, if you click on host preflights, this is all under the create installer section. Host preflights, you click on this, then it will list out all of the available preflight checks. So now let's go back to the presentation here. So now let's talk about default preflight checks. So when you run an installation with kURL, it performs a default set of preflight checks. And there are preflight checks that will run on all nodes, and there are some that will only run when you run it on the primary node. Then there's other preflight checks that will only run on any joining node. So just note that depending on whether it's a primary node or a joining node, there may be a difference on the type of preflights that run. But most will run on both types of nodes. There are also checks that will run on an installation, both on the installation and upgrade. And there's also some that will only run on installations. And of course, depending on the add-ons that you add to your kURL cluster, that will also add extra preflight checks that will be run specific to that add-on. Notice on all the slides as well, there are links to all the sections in the documentation that gives you more details on how to do each of these things. A couple more resources here. This link will give you all the default preflight checks that are included. And this one will take you to the GitHub repository that contains the actual manifest that contains, these are all the collectors and analyzers that run as part of the default cluster. So make sure to check that. Now let's talk about custom preflight checks. That's kind of the next question folks have. Okay, great, you run this by default, but what if I want to change them? What if I want to run different preflight checks? And what you need to kind of first ask yourself this question is, do I want to modify the existing preflights? In other words, I want to take the default preflight checks, but maybe I want to change one of the ports it's checking. Maybe I want to change the CPU, the numbers that it's taken. So how do I do that, right? Or I like the default checks. They're just fine as is, but I want to run additional ones. So once you answer that question, it kind of depends the approach you're going to take. So first, let's look at if you want to modify the default ones. Maybe you want to change the CPU criteria. Well, the default checks cannot be modified. As you saw in that manifest, right? It's embedded when you do an online installation and you don't specify anything about host preflight checks. It pulls that file, it looks at that file, and that's what it runs. So that cannot be modified because any install will use that. So what you can do is you can disable running the default preflight checks, and there's a flag. And then you can use the YAML that I showed you earlier, the default manifest. You can download it. You can edit it as you will. And then you can either include it as part of your Kubernetes installer spec, the kURL spec, or you can also pass it as a patch file during the installation. So those are your options. So if you just want to modify one of the existing preflight checks, you will either modify your kURL spec or you will create a patch file. In this file, you can set the exclude built-in host preflights to true, so you exclude it. And then you define the spec, which again can be based on the default one, and just make your own changes. If you just run additional ones, then you kind of get it, right? It's pretty easy then. All you need to do is specify all the other ones you want to run as well. So either in your kURL spec or in the patch file, simply define the additional ones you want to run, and then they'll be run alongside the default ones. So this is my slide to tell me to go into a demo. So let's do that. So what I did is I created several Kubernetes installers. Let me walk you through them. So the first one, sequence 1, is the default one that gets created by default when you start a new application. Sequence 2, as you can see, I added a section on kURL, the kURL add-on. I set the true to exclude the default checks, and then I added some checks on the CPU. Three is a bad one. I will ignore 3. 4, that's a different one. So this is a more complex example because it's using this TC port status. So since this is one where you may want to run multiple of, the default preflights run several different port status. You would need a TC port status block, these 3 lines for each port that you want to check. So since we want to make sure the analyzer is referencing the right check, you have to give it the collector name. So that's how this analyzer knows to look at the results of the specific demo port status collector. So just note that. So that's a 4. And then 5, I think it's, I set the exclude to false. So in this, it will run the default preflights and then run the demo port status. So I also have the terminal here. I already have done this. So let's do that. Okay, so let's start with spec 1. So you can see the machine at the top, spec 1. So that means it's the sequence 1 of the kURL installer. And in this case, you see all the default preflights that run. So first you see the collectors. Here's one of the TC port status, CPU info. And it runs all the analyzers as well. And you can see they all have passed. So we're good. So this is the one that's the default. So this is what you get by default. In spec 2, we disabled the default ones, and then we added a CPU check. So let's go to spec 2. So you see a much shorter preflight. And this time when I use a smaller VM, so that's why now I'm getting a warning versus no warnings in the previous one. It's just I use a smaller CPU VM. But you can see it only ran the CPU collector and analyzer, right? That was sequence 2 where I specified true, disable built-in preflights, and then I specified the CPU. Let's go to 4. So spec 4 is added a slightly more complex one because I added the ports. But again, it's pretty small, the preflight section, right? Because it's only ran the port check. Now in 5, I said run this port check, but also run the default one. So if we go to spec 5, you see that we have all the collectors that we see. But then you're going to see it also runs my demo port status. That's what I call my collector. So you can see it ran all the other collectors and my demo collector. And then if we go somewhere in here, we'll see demo TCP port status. The 66666 open. So there you can see it ran, again, the default ones on top of ours. Next, I'd like to show you the patch, how we run the patch. So in the patch, I believe is this one right here. So in this case, I create a file. So as you can see in this YAML, I have the exclude built-in preflights to true, so it won't run the default ones, and instead it's just going to run that simple CPU check. So very simple example here. And then the command that I run, as you can see, or go to the tab here, I'm using the beta channel for this video, but then you can see I patched it -s, installer spec, file, and then the patch file, which is this one right here. And by the way, before I ran this, I re-promoted sequence 1 back to excuse me, back to the beta channel. I didn't show you that, but I've been just promoting each spec to the beta channel as I ran each install. So this had sequence 1 again back on the beta channel before I ran this. And as you can see, it did default, it turned off the default ones, and it ran the CPU check. Okay, so I hope this video has been helpful, and now you know a little more about host preflights. Thank you.